All right, it looks like we're good now. Do you want to go ahead and introduce us?
Sure. Let me do this again. Yeah. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Yale International Alliance, or YIA. And thank you very much for your time to attend today's webinar titled Civil War Beyond the Headlines. My name is Kyle Wang. I'm the chair of YIA. We are a Yale alumni shared interest group connecting and inspiring Yale alumni and the general public to become global citizens by fostering the understanding and appreciation among peoples of the world. Now it's my pleasure to introduce my conversational partner, Dr. Miranda Melcher, the real star of today's show. Miranda is a teacher, researcher, and author. She earned her PhD on the post-conflict military reconstruction from King's College London's Defense Studies Department, following her master's degree in intelligence and international studies from King's College London, and her BA from political science from Yale. I guess that, of course. Miranda has taught at the King's College London, Angolan and Mozambican, which is the School of War, and the Northern Illinois University, as well as with the Brilliant Club, a charity where PhD students develop and teach curricula based on their research to underprivileged secondary school students in the United Kingdom. Miranda's courses are titled How to Rebuild a Country After Civil War and How to Write a Peace Treaty. Miranda's love of history is also influenced by her years living and growing up in Beijing, China, and attending British school and with American parents. So today, she continues to explore her multifaceted interest in history as a host on the General History channel of the New Books Network podcast. Now, for those of you who are in the audience who want to raise questions, and please use the Q&A box on your screen. We'll have a few minutes at the end of the webinar to answer them. Now, without further ado, let me begin the conversation. And here's Miranda. Thank you so much for your time. We're delighted to have you.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation.
This is terrific, terrific. Yeah. The first question, general question, to give our audience the idea. Why should people be interested in civil wars?
So this is my favorite question to start with, because this is obviously what I've spent a decent amount of my time so far studying, and yet is not necessarily the first thing people think of when it comes to history or politics or the news. We often are more used to seeing these things in terms of war between countries. I certainly know, for example, growing up in school, that those were the kinds of wars we studied. Those are the ones that sort of everyone knew. And while the news talks a lot about different wars in different places, we don't usually frame them sort of as civil wars as a big group. But actually, since the end of the Cold War, so since 1990 and 1991, civil wars have become by far the most common type of large-scale violence in the world. This is not only because wars between countries have decreased, but also because many more civil wars have broken out and they're taking longer than they used to end. So to give you an idea of this scale, between 1991 and 2009, 47 different civil wars started. So the scale of this is a lot bigger than we might think when we're used to reading headlines that talk about 1, 2, maybe 3 different civil wars at a time. And the scale is pretty big when we think about the time since World War II. We talk about World War II, oh, that was the last big war. Actually, since then, there have been over 129 civil wars across over 63 different countries. So although this is something we don't hear about necessarily as much in our history books, this is a really big problem. This is, again, the most common type of large-scale violence, more than any other sort of thing, more than terrorist attacks, more than big wars between countries. This is actually, when we talk about war, what we really mean. In this period as well, 1 out of every 5 civil wars at a minimum has recurred, which means it ended and then it restarted within 5 years. And this shows that not only are civil wars happening a lot more frequently than we might realize, but we're not actually very good at ending them. When we look at civil wars, a short civil war statistically is probably 6 years. That is quite a long time. And realistically, civil wars are, especially now, dragging past a decade, often past 2 decades. And this is resulting in the suffering of literally millions of people, as well as billions of dollars lost, and global impacts. For example, we have in the world today, as of 2022, 1.47 million refugees, which breaks records that were set only a few years ago. When we talk about refugees, we might be most used to in the UK, for example, people coming over from different countries, trying to get into Western countries, crossing the Mediterranean, etc. But actually, the vast majority of the world's refugees are in refugee camps, not very far necessarily from the countries that they fled. And although we think of these refugee camps often as temporary places, in fact, the average time that a refugee spends in a camp has already gone up. And it was already 17 years on average. It is now 20. So when we talk about civil wars, this is a huge, huge impact. And yet, despite this, it's not necessarily the thing that we think of most frequently when we think about war. And so the reason that I think we need to pay more attention to civil wars, the reason I chose to study them, is because if we're looking to reduce harmful impacts to as many people as possible, civil wars have to be one of the places that we start.
It's a terrific summary, and it reminded me the International Rescue Committee. There's a data shows that some camps has refugees. They're living 3 generations, not even out of the camp. So the grandparents, parents, and the kids know nothing but that camp. So that is such a sad human story. I mean, most people probably, don't know, never heard of that. The size of refugees actually is large. I mean, there's not all because civil wars. Some because of climate change, some because economics is over 80 million in the world running around. It is a problem. And then the next question I have is, how do civil wars relate to other forms of political violence, and explain what constitutes political violence? Categorize revolution, insurrection, whatever. Yeah.
So this is obviously quite a complicated question, because it comes down to definitions. And in some cases, our definitions are easy to understand and pretty clear cut. In some cases, it's very blurry. And so what we've done in academia and research is we've had to draw the line somewhere to make it make sense. But sometimes those lines are a little bit arbitrary, but it helps us kind of make sense of something that could be complicated. So the simplest way to think about it is political violence is a massive umbrella category. There are lots of different types of political violence. Obviously, political violence does not include all violence. You can have violence that is not political. You can also have politics that are not violent, but political violence covers a lot of different things. So this can go from mass scale all the way down to individual things. So the largest scale political violence would be World War, right? Every country in the world, or most countries in the world, all fighting each other. That would be the largest scale form of political violence. The smallest scale form of political violence, lethal political violence, is targeted assassination. So James Bond, realistically. That's, one person trying to kill one other person. That is still lethal, but obviously on a very different scale from something like World War II. In between, we have a lot of trickier things. So we look at things like protests or riots. Realistically, the difference is often in terms of how they're framed. Practically, they may not be necessarily that different analytically. And that, again, can range in scale, that can range in type, that can range across time, reasons, etc. Revolution, similarly, often would be put in the category of that's on the more political side. So a revolution, we would argue, is about changing the political system of a place. So not just taking it over. So if you want to, if there's a set government and you're fine with the type of government, you just want to run it rather than whoever's doing it now, and you overthrow that government, but then do the exact same thing yourself, that's not a revolution. That might be violent, but that's not a revolution because you've not changed the system. Similarly, you can have changes of system that are not violent. Then you have coups, which is the military overthrowing the government pretty specifically. And then civil wars. And in civil wars, we generally talk about four different kinds of wars, really. So the first is wars between countries. We've already talked about those. Probably not going to talk about them again because that's not my research in my area. So, but that's the kind of category one. Category two are civil wars where it's about control of a particular state. And this is primarily what my research is. So there's a government of a country and another group within that country says, no, I want to get rid of you and want to be in charge instead. You can have just one group do this. You can have multiple different groups doing this. They can use lots of different tactics, but that's sort of a classic civil war. You can have international elements involved, but generally that's a classic civil war. The third category are secessionist wars. So one group says, well, actually, I don't want to be part of your country at all. I want to go be my own country. And they fight a war over that. That's secessionism. I don't really work on those kinds of wars because they have different dynamics when it comes to ending them. And then the fourth category is in the news a lot this week, because this is the category that Ukraine is often in, which are internationalized civil wars. So civil wars where there is an internal element and there's also a really strong international element, and you can't really disentangle them. And so those are sort of the types of political violence that can run around. Terrorism is a particular tactic, for example. I'm happy to go into more detail about those if we get questions on them for the audience. But the general idea is that political violence is a big category. There are types within that, civil, interstate, etc. But then things can go in and out of them as well. So you can have a civil war that has a little bit of targeted assassination, or has terrorism for some parts of it, but not others, or has one group that is revolutionary in its ideals, but another group that's not. And all of these things can play into the dynamics of a particular war.
Then there's always the curiosity behind this legitimacy. I mean, we have international law, right? We have international law, and many countries obey to the international law, some kind of, some not. So is it the civil war? That's just in my mind. It's that civil war can be categorized as by the international as legitimate or illegitimate. And I mean, once you have a war, forget about the legitimacy. You know, you're killing me, I'm killing you. So what do you think about that? So
civil wars occupy a really interesting place in international law, because international law that we have now relating to war, a lot of it was written or updated at the end of World War II. So the United Nations was formed then. The Genocide Conventions were in 1949. Sorry, the Genocide Conventions were in 1948. The Geneva Conventions were in 1949. And so these are the kinds of three main parts of international law related to war. And they were all created in this particular moment. And because of that, they were focused pretty heavily on war between countries, because that's what they had just been through with World War I and World War II. And when the debates started to ask, well, hang on a second, what about civil war? Because the moment that they were in, they kind of didn't want to talk about it, because it was also not just the end of World War II, it was also the Cold War and decolonization. So at the same time that the countries who were writing these laws were primarily focused on recovering from World War II, they were also looking ahead and looking at, wait a second, we might start to fight each other because of the Cold War, and we might want to intervene against the other one through a proxy. So we don't really want to create laws that stop that kind of behavior because we might need to do it. Similarly, there were a whole bunch at that moment of decolonization wasn't a given at that point. And so a bunch of these countries that were drafting these laws were thinking about, wait, we have an insurgency in colony X, and we're trying to stop the insurgency. But if we call that a civil war, then that gives them legitimacy to break away and become independent, which we don't want. So one of the reasons that civil wars are very confusing in terms of international law is that civil wars were somewhat purposely excluded from being talked about in international law. And we're only starting since the end of the Cold War to really investigate that in more detail, which is why the International Criminal Court, for example, wasn't established until the late 1990s, even though all the other bits of international law that it goes with are from the mid 20th century. So we haven't really figured that out yet. And that's one of the reasons it can often be confusing.
Sorry, I asked.
No, it's a really interesting topic.
it's a open the can of worms. Sorry, I try to close it.
That's what this whole area of study is. Lots of cans of worms.
Into the next question would be, what are the risk factors most relevant to starting the civil war? And the economics, the political, ideological, or religious, or, racial, all the sort of things that factor probably have to do with the ignite the civil war. Could you elaborate a little bit on that? Yeah.
Yeah, so this is something that often gets a lot of attention in the press in particular. And coming at it as an academic, it's a little complicated. So first of all, no one yet has figured out how to exactly predict when a civil war will start. Mm-hmm. To be perfectly frank, anyone who says that they have, I would love to see it. As far as I know, we haven't figured it out yet. So, for example, with the Arab Spring, why did that particular protest in Tunisia spark off the whole thing? We don't know. It wasn't the first protest that looked exactly the same. Why did that one have such a big impact? Why was it that day, not the day before, the day after? We don't know. That's actually not something we yet can determine. What we can determine, however, is the types of ways in which different categorizations can be made, and then how they can be leveraged in ways that can lead to violence or can enable further violence. So we've generally moved away from, in the study, of thinking that certain things are inevitably risk factors. So it was a thing, especially in the 60s and 70s, to think that the more different languages and different racial identities that a country might have, therefore they're going to have more war. We've actually found, in looking at that again, that actually it's really not that clear cut. And in fact, that's probably an outdated assumption. What we can look at, however, is that it's not so much about the particular risk factors, whether it's political identity, racial identity, religious identity, language, etc. It's not one of those is more combustible than the other. Mm-hmm. It's about how identities are used, often used by elites, to make people go us and them. And that's where the problem comes in. So it's not the identity itself that causes issues. It's when these existing differences are, as we say, operationalized, are made into reasons to dislike each other. And this is particularly potent when it comes to violence, when it looks like these different identities are not just different, but that by virtue of being part of a different group, someone gets better treatment than you. For no other reason. That's the only reason. They are a member of a group that you are not, and they therefore get better treatment. And that the only way to resolve this issue is violence. That there is no non-violent way. There's no way through the current political system. There's no economic compromise. There's no other cultural way of negotiating this. And that's when we see identity issues become operationalized into violence. But it's no longer really standard in the field to think about the risk factors, particularly around religion more than socioeconomic status or something like that. It's more about the way in which identities are used by elites rather than anything inherently about one identity versus another.
So it's mostly by elites and not by the common people on the streets. Can common people on the streets have identity? They don't wage war.
Well,
so
it does
really
depend,
elite.
Right? People can also can make themselves into elites, right? We also, elites really just means at this point, from a civil wars point of view, people who organize groups, people who are in charge of groups of people that can be violent. You don't have to start off being a president or something to end up with that kind of power. So you can mobilize around these ideas, but it does take some amount of mobilizing. It's not just innate and inevitable in a group of people.
The next question, getting a little bit more easier or harder. You see, under what circumstances civil war becomes a proxy war of foreign nations? And what are the most common causes for foreigners going to participate in other people's nations of war? And in any cases you see the war is winnable?
So countries get involved in other countries' civil wars pretty much all the time. In fact, it's not unusual. The scale of it can sometimes be unusual. So full-scale military intervention, we're going to send 10,000 of our troops over. That doesn't happen as often, though it happens more than we might think. But the idea of one country kind of going, "Ooh, you're having a war, cool. I'm going to like make some good trade deals that work for me that you have to accept because you really need the money right now." Okay. And that's going to allow you to keep fighting for a longer time. So it's actually quite common. And the biggest reasons that countries get involved in other countries' civil wars is because, quite simply, they think they're going to get something out of it. Whether it's in the short term while the war is going on, they can get better deals, better relationships, more leverage politically, or whether it's they would prefer one side to be in charge than the other, and they think that by helping that side will therefore more likely win. That second thing, so the first thing that they're hoping to get out of it is relatively successful. The second thing, we want these guys to win. If we intervene, they are more likely to win. Turns out is actually not super true. There's actually some really good research coming out this year, last year, exploring that particularly. And it shows that a lot of the assumptions that governments make about how impactful their intervention will have on someone else's civil war are actually massive overestimations. And instead, what it usually does is it just makes the war last longer. It doesn't actually have that much impact on who wins. So it's something to be quite skeptical of when we're looking at foreign intervention. And the second part of your question, foreign people, so just normal people going and fighting in wars in other places, there are lots of reasons. The main reason is it's ideological. It's a belief. We do have mercenaries. That's less of a thing than it used to be. And when there are mercenaries, they tend to be state-sponsored. So the Wagner Group in Africa, for example, is a good example. But when we are talking about collectives going or individuals going, it's usually ideology. Today, the last 20 years, the ideology has mostly been radical Islam. But the exact same thing happened with Franco's Spain in the 30s. And that was radical leftism. There's nothing inherently different really between those two. So just because today our examples might be more about religion doesn't mean that inherently that's the only reason people would go somewhere else to fight.
All right. Very exciting. God, I mean, war's bad anyway. Any war is not preferred means of solving problems. But yeah, let's see. Next question I have is, what do civil wars mostly commonly end? How? I mean, how do, yeah.
So this is my research, is looking at how to more successfully end civil wars. So to do that, we do need to look at, to some degree, how they start. But actually, especially given how long civil wars are going on for, why they start isn't necessarily the most impactful thing by the time the war is over, right? As you said a minute ago, Kyle, you're like, well, at first it's about international law, but now you're shooting me, so I'm shooting you, right? The actual war itself tends to change things. But the interesting thing that we've seen since about the 1980s onwards is that the vast majority of civil wars actually end through negotiation. One side doesn't just win. That does sometimes happen these days, but much, much less than it used to. And if one side is going to win, it generally happens within the first 12 months. So if the civil war is longer than 12 months long, you're almost inevitably looking at a negotiated settlement. So some kind of peace treaty. And this is my research, because we have, therefore, a lot of peace treaties. We have a lot of civil wars, a lot of negotiation, a lot of peace treaties, and yet they don't stick that well. They take a long time to negotiate. and they don't work often. So my research is in investigating this, are there things we can find out to make those peace treaties more likely to work? That's what I tried to answer in my PhD.
I see. So, so the all-out war, one winner take it all. That's less likely.
Yeah, that happens a lot less now.
For less because it's so complicated, or both sides are.
We don't really know exactly why it happens less. My things that I think are probably relevant to it is that it is much easier to get access to weaponry now. So it is easier to continue fighting, even if you don't have a lot of money. It is easier to access the politics now. It's easier to get your message across. It's easier to convince people to support you because we now have technology that is much cheaper and much more accessible to communicate with. So there are situations now where in the past, you simply would have gone, okay, we've used up our last bullet and there aren't, like, we can't do it anymore and no one's listening to us. We don't have an option. It is much harder for those situations to happen today because of how accessible communication and weapons are.
But was that anything to do with the support of the general population in that country? It must have some factor, right?
Well, but that's exactly the point, is that because technology is more accessible, you can recruit support from the population much more easily. It's harder to stop you connecting with the population than it used to be. And therefore, if you maintain support from the population, you can keep fighting.
All right. So now we're going to a nitty-gritty part. How does your research show about the specific ways, the type of ways to end the civil war? This is something I add there. Is there any factors to prevent the civil war from recurring once it's ended? Once, and it, so not another 4 years, 5 years, restart again.
Right. So this is exactly the problem that I investigated, is what do we put in a peace treaty to make it stick? And the way in which I did this, for those of you interested in methods, is I'm a qualitative case study comparative historian. So I look at particular cases and I go massively in depth and investigate exactly what happened. I'll look at archives, I'll go interview people who are involved, and I try and reconstruct how the treaty was negotiated, what was actually written down, and how it was implemented, and to compare multiple instances of this to figure out which bits worked and which bits didn't. And therefore, what can we see about general best practice? So my case studies for the PhD were Angola and Mozambique. So that's a total of 4 peace treaties, 2 of which stuck, 2 of which failed. And generally what I found, the other reason those cases are useful is because they were, all those negotiations were in the 90s and early 2000s and provided the basis for a lot of ideas about how peacekeeping, UN intervention, treaty writing works. And so a lot of other things have been modeled after them. So what I found is that generally the blueprint for what we do at the end of a war in one of these treaties is we tend to focus on the politics. And I actually argue that this causes problems. Because by focusing on the politics, this usually means democracy, and this usually means elections. Those are not inherently bad things. The problem is if you've got, for example, 2 sides that have been fighting each other for 20-something years, and you say, okay, great, we're going to stop fighting now, and we're going to resolve this issue of who gets to run the country by having an election. But then the election results with one side winning. That doesn't exactly resolve the war, right? You've just translated the physical battle to a political battle, but there's almost no incentive for the side that loses the election to accept that result. And so what we end up having is these winner-take-all elections. And that's what the focus is of negotiation and the treaties and the implementation, which is problematic in and of itself because the elites don't want to accept losing. And having a system where only one side gets to control the government just replicates the conditions we ended up with to get to the Civil War in the first place. More importantly, though, what the focus on high politics misses is it misses making sure that the people actually able to enact violence are happy. Because realistically, if we're thinking about it, the top 10 people on either side of the Civil War, if they're happy with the outcome, but all the people who actually fought for them are not happy, well, where are we going to go with violence, right? If you've got 20 leaders at the top saying, yeah, we're good, and everyone underneath them is going, no, we're really not, how do you think that's going to go? And in fact, we see this happen. We literally have seen this happen in Sierra Leone and Cote d'Ivoire, where the elites were like, yep, we're good with this deal, we're happy. And their rank and file were saying, hang on a second, this deal does not do anything for us. And in fact, the war's restarted. So what's in the treaty that doesn't go well? It's often this thing called DDR. So DDR is a UN acronym that stands for disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. So it's a 3-step process to deal with the fact that after a civil war, you can't have more than one army. So you have to get rid of some of the fighters. And so you do this through the 3-step process. So first, people give up their weapons, disarmament, demobilization, they take off their uniforms and go home, and reintegration, they get civilian jobs. There has been billions of dollars invested into these programs. The programs are not inherently problematic, except the way that they are often implemented, which is that only one side has to go through them. And so the idea is going back to the winner takes all election. So you've got party A and party B. They've been fighting for 30 years. They now go have an election. Party A wins. Party B, what do they do now? They've lost. How does that satisfy their goals? And then you say, okay, party A, you get to stay and be the national army. Party B, you have to give up your weapons, take off your uniform, go home. If you've been fighting against the people that are now in charge, do you feel safe giving up your weapons? Do you feel safe going back to a place that you may not have been to in 10 or 15 years because you've been fighting? And then reintegration to civilian life. Do you have any skills as a civilian? Do you want to go back to school at the age of goodness knows what to learn them? Are you able to get a job that can support your family with this lack of skills? It's not a very good solution to people who are very good at committing violence. So what I look at is situations where we've integrated them, where we've gone, okay, we need to think about how we can share, how we can collaborate. So power sharing on the political side. For example, elections, but elections for a parliament or a Congress where it's not just one party completely wins, where you can split things up. So for example, this department is run by that party, but this department's run by another. So again, it's not just one side. Similarly, in the military, how can you integrate everyone into one security institution so that the people who have skills in these areas can still have a way to support themselves, feel like the deal is working for them? And this is the key that my research has highlighted, is that in order to make these negotiations, the writing and the implementing of a peace treaty, we need to promote dignity. So all sides need to feel equally able to participate and be heard during negotiations. We need to prioritize logistics. So think about the practical side of this. Think about whether you'd feel safe giving up your weapons and how that would work. Enable flexibility. So there's not going to be exactly the same thing that's going to work in every situation. Institutionalize cooperation. So it shouldn't just be about the winner being nice and letting the other side in. We have to make sure that there are structures in place so that one side can't abuse the other afterwards. And finally, we have to manage expectations. If you talk about, we're going to have an election that will solve everything, and then one side wakes up and goes, hang on, you've just made my situation so much worse, then that delegitimizes the entire peace process. And I can go into those in more detail. I have so many stories of particular instances of what happens. But those are the things that I argue in my research shows we need to be taking into account in order to more successfully end civil wars.
do you take into account any economic factors that if both sides fight for economic gain, of course, that's pretty clear, right? They want resources, they want, they want more this, more that. Now, if not for that, for religious reason, for their ideal, that's kind of hard. That you have to be patient to like, this is them, this is us, and we have to somehow figure out a way together. But for the economic side of it, can a quick and dirty way to get everybody all well fed and just say that if a foreign proxy is there, and no, I mean the involvement there, then they put an economic aid. Is that a way diffuse the conflict very quickly for both sides?
I mean, the problem is the scale that we're talking. I mean, is there really any country that could go completely feed a whole nother country forever, right? So then it becomes it's about the equality of perception as well. So, okay, you're giving us food, but why are we getting it faster than them? Or why are they getting better than us, right? That could be like a Band-Aid, I guess, but it doesn't really solve the issue. Yeah. So I noticed we've got some great questions from the audience. Should we go ahead and start with those?
Yeah, we could take a look at some questions. Ooh, some questions are really good, very long. Let me right, you talk about the operationalization of the violence and by elite or whatever. Yeah, so there's questions by Gavin. It's what is the best way to diffuse, discourage, or prevent the operationalization of them versus us, that kind of thinking?
So this isn't exactly my specialty. So there will definitely be people that have like more citations on this. But my personal answer is education, and particularly education around critical thinking. It's literally no one has only one identity. Everyone has multiple identities all the time.
Good point.
So we have identities around gender, we have identities of place, we have identities of political views, religion, all sorts of things. And they're never all going to be in perfect agreement. And the more we can encourage people to think critically, the harder it is to convince them that one identity matters more than anything else. That's when identities get operationalized, when your whole person just becomes about one thing, where you are only a woman, not anything else. You are only a Republican and not anything else. And the more we can teach people about complexity and being okay with complexity and seeing detail and nuance, the harder it is to convince people that they are only one thing.
Well, there's many interesting questions. Okay, this one possibly tough, controversial, but it's nice. Let's do it this way. I host a common room discussion group on the Sino-US relations, right? So I've been doing this for quite a time. We have a talk about specifically about the media. A lot of media news, either fake news or news, whatever it is, so involved in censorship, involving a distorted picture of something, whatever you go in there. Then the censorship can come from a media company or technology company, whatever it is. And we have a guest here, Eric, asking, is a censorship by big tech in the media, like Facebook, something, would that be considered a political violence if that thing spread, eventually become a violent outcome? Is that categorized as that? Can we do that?
So I would argue that censorship is not in and of itself political violence, but can easily lead to political violence. I think there is an argument to be made, like that's not clear cut. You could make an argument that censorship in and of itself is political violence, the same way that you can make arguments around hate speech. But my personal take, again, that's not my particular area, but my sort of initial response would be that censorship is less political violence itself, but could very easily lead to political violence.
I see.
And I think that's true no matter who's doing the censoring, whether that's a government or a non-state actor or a technology company. I think that's true regardless. I don't think it matters whether it's a government or Facebook doing the censorship.
Now, Maria asked a question. Can you comment on Syria as an example? Is that over? Is that over? How do you see that situation evolving?
So Syria, the Syrian civil war is a really interesting example. It has over the war so far exemplified a lot of things I've talked about in terms of duration, in terms of victory, in terms of other countries getting involved, in terms of refugees. Generally, the consensus amongst civil war scholars at the moment is that no, Syria is not over. It is still an active civil war. The definition that we use for civil war is generally 1,000 deaths a year. That's usually where we draw the line. So Syria is not over. The political situation has changed pretty dramatically from a few years ago. So the trajectory looks like at the moment, the regime will survive and is in the process of finishing up, stamping out resistance in certain areas. But we have seen the trajectory of what's going to happen in Syria change radically about twice so far in this civil war. So just because this is what it looks like right now, I don't think means this is inevitably what's going to happen. Particularly the areas to watch for me in Syria are the eastern parts of the country, where the government has a lot less practical control than it often will say it does. So I don't think it's over. I do understand and probably agree with it not being in the headlines as much anymore.
Faded away, beyond the headlines. Okay. Mina asked a question. Some argue that authoritarian systems are most successful in preventing conflict in diverse or fragile countries and in creating order post-conflict. Do you have a view on whether authoritarian or democratic systems are more likely to prevent conflict or best resolve civil conflict?
So I'll start with the easy side first, which is the resolving conflict. Authoritarian states can be better than democratic states at ending conflict. But I would argue that that is not the same thing as resolving conflict, right? So for example, we'll take the example of Grozny in Chechnya or Aleppo in Syria. Russia, in both cases, did a really good job of ending the conflict in those two cities by bombing the whole place to smithereens. Did they resolve anything politically? No. Are the political aspects of the identities of both of those places vis-a-vis the main regime to this day still contested and weird? Yeah. But is there active fighting in the street? No. Russia successfully stopped the fighting. That is not the same thing as resolving a conflict. And so I think that's often where we get conflated is lack of violence the same thing as resolution? And if we're just looking at lack of violence, sometimes authoritarian countries are better, usually only if they're willing to use force. And just because they're authoritarian does not mean they're always willing to use force. In terms of preventing, it really depends. And I think that it is much harder to make that call than it might have been a few decades ago because of what I was saying earlier about technology and communication. Authoritarian countries generally are more willing to censor things. It is much harder to censor things than it used to be. And so it's harder to keep people separate, keep people ignorant of each other than it used to be. Now, some authoritarian states are still very good at it, mostly the ones that have invested a massive amount of time and effort and infrastructure in trying to preserve all of those things. But an increasingly fewer numbers of countries can just do that. I think a lot of countries probably want to, but it's a much harder thing to accomplish now. That said, I don't think democratic countries are necessarily inherently more able to prevent conflict or resolve conflict. They have different problems, essentially, than authoritarian countries. It is easier, for example, to resolve conflict by saying, we want everyone to have a voice in politics. On the other hand, the larger your committee of decision makers, the harder it is to come up with anything that happens. So it really does depend a lot on the situation, what sort of things can really make a difference. And this is also why we have things like international organizations, right? This is the window that they fill, where instead of trying to wait for a country coming out of a conflict to become perfectly democratic, well, you can't really do that because people are starving and need food right now. But you don't want the country to become authoritarian just because it's easier to deal with logistics. So you could do things like help a country become democratic, and in the meantime, the World Bank funds food, or the United Nations comes in and provides security. And those are sort of bridges that allow for more development rather than, okay, well, the only option to get everyone food is a centrally organized system. And the only way we can do that is with strong authoritarian management. Like, well, no, we have international organizations that can help with this.
Complicated, yeah. No straight yes or no answers. So yeah, is expecting everything in life just like that. Yeah. The question that you're talking about, some state authoritarian state invest massive amount of assets and all that, and to make it authoritarian and censor that. This Karen asked a question. This question probably most is for both of us. You, with your first-hand experience and contacts in China, you grew up there. I was born there, also grew up there. And what are your thoughts on the chance of large-scale civil war in China? That it's like, I don't have a crystal ball on that one, and but academically speaking, my feeling is it really depends on the people on the street how happy they are. Depending on most people on the streets in the household, if 85-90% people, they're not elite. Actually, they're not elite. If they're happy, they're complacent, whatever it is, I think the chance for China to revolt, become a civil war inside, it's not that high. Having said that, I really don't know where the military is sided with. It's most important is where the military is sided with the elite, or the commanders, all the folks are actually come from the common folks. So in that way, I really don't. Do you have any light to shed on that one?
I mean, I think I agree with what you've said so far, particularly the idea that when we look at a revolution or attempt to overthrow any government, the big question is, which way does the army jump? That is often the big question. My guess would be that the Chinese government has put a lot of effort into making sure that the PLA will stick with them. Mm-hmm. They've spent decades making sure that that link is very strong. I wouldn't be surprised if that link is very strong. Mm-hmm. Whether or not that would be enough, I think could depend. But I do think that that is a really big factor that often when we think about or hear in the news, sort of the CCP will fall, is something that maybe isn't being taken into account enough when people try and make those kinds of predictions.
Okay, now have a very little time left. So let me see what else there. Yeah, that one. Oops, somebody.
I think I think those are the only questions.
No,
I know there was one about negotiated settlements, but I think I answered that already.
I think you did. You did. I lose questions somehow. Yeah, I got.
Yeah, we've got a few minutes left. Does anyone have any final questions you want to type
right,
in?
exactly. It is a very complicated subject beyond the headlines. You just read the headlines, you don't know all the nuances. Everything in Civil War, Civil War. Yeah. It's and I learned so much from this conversation, and also you're right on. And everybody's identity is not just straightforward, just one.
Yeah.
You get multiple identities. There's a book called The Symphony of Self. It's written about it in a biologically where we have many different personalities. And it's true that you cannot say I'm extroverted and introverted, or I'm a, this type of, that type of person. Actually, you're all kinds of person, depending on the situation, depending on how you react to certain things, right? And you're very conservative this way, you're liberal that way. It's just all over places. It's very complicated. Yeah.
Well, it looks like we've got one last question, examples related to DDR from Paul. So I will go ahead and share a few, I think two quick examples of how these sorts of things can play out in practice. So one that was particularly interesting is around this idea of dignity and perception of equality, that it's not just about the practical things of how many guns, how many tanks. It's also about what people think about it. So in Mozambique, one of my case study countries, the plan for the peace treaty was to have an integrated military between the two sides that had been fighting a civil war for quite a while. And in order to do this, both sides had to go to separate camps. They were scattered all across the country. There were some for one side, some for the other. And in these camps, they had to register themselves and their weapons and then decide, do I want to join the integrated military, or do I want to go home and try and be a civilian? And both sides got this choice. And these camps were run by the United Nations peacekeepers. The camps were pretty much equal. They were designed to be as equal as possible. So one side, even though one side was the government and one side were rebels, they weren't necessarily treated differently. And the idea was that it had been set ahead of time that each side was responsible for sending a certain number of their fighters to the camps each month. So if you've got 50,000 fighters total, each month you send 5. And so over the course of a year, you get through most people, right? That was the idea. And it would be after being processed through these camps for about 3 weeks that then they get shipped off to the integrated military barracks and start working on being an army together. So this was the plan. Everyone agreed to the plan. And the first 3-4 months, everything was on track. And then suddenly, months 5, 6, and 7, the numbers of rebel fighters turning up to the rebel camps dropped, massively dropped. And then months 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, etc., the numbers went right back up. And I saw this in the archives, like the numbers just drastically went down, but just for this little period. And I was like, okay, what happened? It was only on the rebel side. I hadn't read about any like outbreak of violence, natural disaster, like what was happening. And so I went and interviewed some of the senior rebel commanders and some of the senior UN peacekeepers who had been there. And they said, oh, right, it was the toothpaste. And I was like, what? What are you talking about? And what had happened was that the UN had planned for what was going to be provided in these camps based off an assumption of what the soldiers would be bringing to the camps with them. And the idea was that each soldier is going to come by themselves and bring like their uniform and their like standard army kit, right? Like the backpack that they walk around with. And they had made that assumption, which for the government soldiers was true. They'd been trained by the Soviets and outfitted in a lot of cases by the Soviets. And so they would show up with these standard packs. So the UN gave them food, medicine, and housing, but didn't provide like clothing or shoes or anything like that because the soldiers had them with them. The problem was on the rebel side, they had been fighting in the bush for decades and didn't have that kind of training and support and didn't have their own kits. So they were turning up to the same UN camps, but they didn't have necessarily shoes or toothpaste. And so what we were seeing is even though the camps were equal, because the people coming in had different things, there were significantly higher hygiene issues and medical issues in the rebel camps. And it made the rebels in the camps very discontented. They're like, I don't like being in these camps. It's dirty, it's smelly, I'm not getting the support that I need. Why should I sit here? Why should I deal with this? And they would tell their friends who hadn't come into the camps yet, like, don't bother coming. It sucks. Why would I do this? And sure enough, the numbers went down. So the UN figured out what was happening, went to some of the big toothpaste companies in the world, Colgate, Crest, etc., and said, hey, we've got this peace process in Mozambique. We'd really love it if you could support us. You know those little travel kits that you make, like that you give people on airplanes?
Yeah.
Can we just have like 30,000 of those? It will save the peace process. And
Wow.
the toothpaste companies were like, yeah, sure, okay. Like, we don't care. And the numbers went back up. And so it sounds like such a small thing, toothpaste. And yet, turns out it really matters.
Wow, unbelievable, unbelievable. Thank you so much. We end on the toothpaste. Terrific. So we almost run out of time. Let me end this with a little bit of administrative things here. Next week at the same time, Thursday, we'll have a follow-up discussion. I think there's a lot of questions that are unanswered here. There's some people already in Yale Alumni's common room. More than welcome to tune in next week at the same time. We'll send out the invitation later on. So having said all that, and thank you so much for everybody's time and your interest in this fascinating subject. And Miranda, it's so wonderful to see you again, and wish you all the best. Everybody have a great day. Yeah.
Thank you, Everett, for coming. I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing some Yaleys in a follow-up discussion next week.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you, everybody.